Welcome everybody. It's really good to see all of your faces. Some of you I just see names, but I'm really glad you're here. I like to welcome, recognize some of the administrators that we have here in the College of Education. I see Interim Dean Deb Riffenberry. I see Incoming Dean Hansel Burley, and I see Associate Dean of Research Sylvia Celadon. And I think that's it in terms of the College of Education. And I think I see Derek Lenty. Is that you, Senator Denner? Oh, that is Representative Derek Lenty. Your hair has grown. We all have longer hair. So, okay, well, I want to welcome everybody, and people will be signing in as they get set up with the Zoom. But I want to welcome everyone to our very first virtual gathering. It's a 2.5-hour session, and we understand that some people will go in and out, and that's okay. All of you should have received a lot of documents from Brianna, and Brianna, I want to thank you very much for doing all this work. She's the person that you go to if you have any questions, but she basically is the person who put everything together. So thank you, Brianna. Thumbs up to you. So what we have is, if you take a look at your calendar or your agenda, we would like to just do a brief introduction. So I would like to have each IAIE member just briefly say your name and maybe the department you're at and your nation that you come from, just so people know who you are. And then we'll go from there to the IAIE Advisory Council, and we'll move from there, okay? All right, so Terry, I see you in the first year on my first cell. So Terry, we'll start off with you. We'll go to Terry, Leola, Lloyd, and then Greg Kahady. And that's all I see right here so far. Okay, Terry? Oh, and Wendy, sorry, Wendy. Terry?
Me, Terry?
Yes, Terry Flaherty.
I'm Terry Flowerday, a professor of educational psychology, and from the Sicangu Lakota Nation, Rosebud.
Leola?
Hello, I'm Leola Sinajini Pequin from Native American Studies, and I'm Diné and Filipino from Torreon, New Mexico.
Lloyd?
Yate Bina, Lloyd Lee and Share, Ki Ani Nashlin, Class Che Bashichin, Ashida Shache, or Topahe de Chanela, Katadan and Shlin. Good morning, everyone. My name is Lloyd Lee. I'm an associate professor in the Native American Studies Department here at UNM, and I'm Navajo.
Okay. Wendy?
Hi, everybody. I'm Navajo, and I'm originally from Kayenta, Arizona, and I'm an assistant professor in the Native American Studies Department.
Greg? Greg Kahady? Greg, we can't hear you. Okay.
All right. Sangitamo, as we say in Santa Clara Pueblo. I'm from Santa Clara Pueblo. My name is Greg Kahete. I'm professor in LLSS and also Native American Studies. And welcome, everyone. Glad to see all your faces.
Okay. All right, Penny? All right, let's go ahead and go with the IAIE advisory. Let's go ahead and start off with Belen. And I think I see Berlinda and Danielle. So go ahead and with those three first, please.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Belen Sinajini. I'm an assistant professor of mathematics at Santa Fe Community College. I'm Diné Filipino and from Torreon, New Mexico.
Okay, thank you. Danielle?
Yate, Shay Danielle Lansing in Chia. Azatlan and Shlom, but Annie Vashish Chin. Now, Kate Night, I should trade dog and Luchin international big about Hodzanda and Asha. Good morning, everyone. I'm Danielle Lansing, and I'm a faculty member in early childhood education at Southwestern Indian Polytechnic Institute, and I'm originally from Piñon, Arizona.
Welcome. Berdine?
My name is Berdine Largo. I'm from the Mesclera Apache tribe, and I am a special education director here for our BIE school.
Okay, welcome. Okay, Berlinda.
Got a Shaper Linda Bigayan, Shiabitanin, Schlant, Hatnasani, Bashichin, Kishlichini, Dashichi, Dashi, Dashanala, Setlichi, Das Aha, Doena Shah. Good morning. I'm Berlinda Bigay. I'm the bilingual multicultural coordinator for Central Consolidated Schools.
Welcome. Antutuay. Alice.
Good morning. I'm Alice Martinez. I'm a Tiwa language instructor at the Taos Municipal Schools for the Enos Garcia Elementary, and I also teach adult classes at the Pueblo from Taos Pueblo. Ta'a. Thank you.
Nathaniel.
Good morning. My name is Nathaniel Charlie. I'm currently an English teacher and the defensive coordinator for the Rio Rancho High School. I come from the Dene Nation. And good morning, everybody.
Good morning. Are there any other IAIE Advisory Council members or IAIE faculty that I missed or staff?
Yes, Glennie, good morning.
Oh, hi, Lorinda.
This is Lorinda Balone. I am an associate professor within health, exercise, and sports sciences. I'm Navajo and glad to join you all this morning. I'm going to have to duck out for students' defense in about 45 minutes. So I wish you all a good meeting.
Okay, thank you. Well, without any further ado, I am so proud and so honored that we have Ms. Gail Evans with us. I've watched her from a distance for many years, serve in so many capacities, using her skills as a lawyer, her humanity as a mother, as well as a community member in doing all the good work that needs to be done to serve social justice across the state of New Mexico. She was recently with the New Mexico Center on Law and Poverty and has recently moved to the New Mexico Environmental Law Center. She was the lead attorney on the Yazzie, for the Yazzie plaintiffs in the Yazzie Martinez versus State of New Mexico case. You may have read some of her quotations. She's often referenced in many newspaper articles in the New Mexican Albuquerque Journal and beyond. And she has agreed to give us an update on the status of the Yazzie Martinez suit and the judge's ruling. So Ms. Evans, thank you. Again, thank you for being here. And I know that you have to leave at 11:30, so we understand that.
Can you all see that?
Yes, we can. Thank you very much.
Oh, good. Okay. Thank you for your patience. Okay. So thank you for giving me this opportunity. I'm going to do a little bit of background just because I wasn't sure how much everybody here knew about the case. And really, I wanted you all to have these slides. They're pretty dense with some information that I hope will be helpful for all of you in the future. So let me see if I can now figure out how to navigate. Here we go. So I always like to start with the New Mexico Constitution. This is the piece of the New Mexico Constitution that the entire case hangs on. It's called the Educational Clause, and it provides that the state must provide a uniform system of free public schools sufficient for the education for all of our children. And so this is a state constitutional obligation and actually gives our students the constitutional right to what's called in the Constitution a sufficient education. So when we look at that constitutional clause, we have to think about who our students are. And the students that we set out to represent in this case are Native American students, English language learner students, students with disabilities, and students from low-income families. And as you can see, that makes up a very large portion of our New Mexico student body. When we also started looking at that educational clause in the Constitution and how it could be enforced, we started looking at things that I'm sure all of you are very familiar with, but basically the low educational outcomes of our students. So these are just some of these sorts of facts that, again, I'm sure you're all familiar with. But more importantly, we started looking at how our state school system is run and how the budget is actually not built on what our students' needs are, but instead is just built on what was last year's budget, and then how much money do we have this year, and are we going to add or subtract? We also found that a lot of research had been done in our state showing what our students need in school to succeed, but that those programs and services were never adequately funded. They were never made available to all of our students who needed them. And as we started digging into the school system in the state, we found that New Mexico has some really great laws on the books. Most importantly, the New Mexico Indian Education Act, which I'm sure most of you are familiar with. But this is a law that has never been properly funded and has never been implemented, even though it sets forth very clearly what our Native students need to be able to succeed in school. And we have a few other important laws on the books that have also never been enforced or funded, including the New Mexico Hispanic Education Act and the New Mexico Bilingual Multicultural Education Act, which, similar to the New Mexico Indian Education Act, calls for a culturally and linguistically responsive education for all of our students and recognizes that that's what's necessary for our students to do well in school. So these laws have never been funded and never been enforced. So knowing all of this, back in March of 2014, Wilhelmina Yazzie, who is Dene and who has children attending the Gallup school system, filed suit along with the Gallup-McKinley School District. We represented them, and the suit claimed simply that the state had failed to fulfill its constitutional obligation to provide a school system that allowed our children to succeed and be college and career ready. So basically just alleging a violation of that constitutional clause. And I think it's important to remember that the case is really based on the strengths of our state. It's based on the strengths of our children and our cultural and linguistic diversity. And it's also based on the educational expertise and knowledge, including many of the people on this call, that we know what our children need to do well in school. And we know that these things have never been properly funded or resourced by the state of New Mexico. So the case grew. It started with just Ms. Yazzie and the Gallup School District, but eventually we were joined by other families and by 6 school districts, Rio Rancho, Lake Arthur, Moriarty, Santa Fe, and Cuba joined with Gallup. And we sued the state of New Mexico, which includes the legislature and the executive branch, meaning the governor, and the PED had to be named as the department because it's the PED and the Secretary of Education that's responsible under the law to run the school system. At the same time, there was another case being developed by the Mexican American Legal Defense and Education Fund, the Martinez case. And the 2 cases were consolidated together. They were very similar, both claiming an insufficient education for our students. So we all went to trial together, and that's why the case is called Yazzie Martinez or Martinez Yazzie. It's because it was 2 cases that were joined together. And we've worked together in the end to present all of the evidence at trial. And the trial was back in the summer of 2017. And I always like to show this slide because it shows Dr. Joseph Swina. And in the other slide, you can see far off in the distance, Regis Pecos. And there was quite a bit of testimony, especially from these 2 men about Native American education. Dr. Sweeney testified about the whole history of education for Native Americans in this country and how that history has an ongoing impact on Native American education today and on Natives' relationships with the school system. And Regis Pecos testified primarily about the Indian Education Act and how it was developed and how each piece of that act is critical to providing a sufficient and necessary education for Native students. So about a year later, we got a decision that we had won. And this decision and order is something I would really encourage all of you to read. I'm going to just tell you a little bit about it. The judge ruled that the state constitution requires that every student be given the opportunity to be prepared for career or college. So basically, she took that constitutional provision that calls for a sufficient education, and she had to decide, what does that mean? And she decided that sufficiency means the opportunity to be college and career ready. And she said that in order for that to happen, certain things, basically everything, needed to be fixed. That we needed to have in place a multicultural framework. We needed effective programs and services for our students. We needed to improve our teacher recruitment, retention, and capacity building. We needed a funding system that was adequate, that the current one was not. And we needed an accountability system that was adequate, and the current one is not. So I think 5 important takeaways from that judge's original decision is that all children have the right to be college and career ready, and that the state is violating our students' rights. And that importantly, when we're talking about constitutional rights, and this is an important point for people to remember, that there's very few things in our state budget that are actually rooted in a constitutional right. And education is one of them. And so the state is actually not permitted under the Constitution to sacrifice constitutional rights just due to saying we have a lack of money. So they have to find the money, and the court was very clear about that. The court also said that the state had until April of 2019 to take some initial steps to direct resources to our children. And the court, importantly, maintained what we call in the law jurisdiction. It means the court maintained its authority to have oversight over this case to ensure that the state did the work that was required to transform our education system, our funding, our accountability, and to make sure the services and programs are provided to our at-risk students. And I don't think I was clear at the beginning, but in the case, the court defined at-risk students as those 4 student groups I mentioned at the beginning: Native American students, English language learners, students from low-income families, and students with disabilities. So just focusing for a bit with this group on Native students, the court found that the failure to comply with the Indian Education Act is actually a violation of the state constitution. So this is really important. It puts the level of the Indian Education Act up to being a constitutional right. And she actually went through each individual prong of the Indian Education Act and determined that a violation of that piece of the act was a violation of the Constitution. Also importantly for Native students, the court found that for Native kids, the opportunity to be college and career ready means that Native kids have to have that opportunity both inside and outside of their tribal community. So recognizing the unique status of Native children who have opportunities and obligations to their Native community and not just to the outside community. So digging in a little bit to that original decision and order, when the judge wrote about the Indian Education Act, she found, sorry, I'm going to have to plug in my computer apparently. She wrote specifically about the need for the Indian Education Division to be fully staffed. She wrote about the need for a culturally relevant education for our students. And she wrote about the need to develop meaningful government-to-government relationships between the tribe and the state. And then something that I think a lot of people aren't as familiar with, a few months later, the judge issued what's called findings of fact and conclusions of law. And that's where she really spelled out, I mean, this is a very long, it's like 600 pages, but spelled out in great detail what were all the factual findings that led her to conclude that the entire school system is unconstitutional. And there were a lot of findings there about Native students and about the legacy of trauma for Native students in our schools and the need to maintain Native languages in our schools. So I just wanted you all to have this and to have, these are just a few of the findings that I pulled out, but there are dozens and dozens of critical findings for Native American education, all which we believe puts an obligation on the state to meet these concerns. So we set about, after the court ruled, I guess we even started before the court ruled, but we set about to develop what we called a platform of remedies, really saying, you know, it's one thing to say the state's violating the Indian Education Act or violating the state constitution, but what does the state need to do, really step by step, to fix this problem? So we drew together people from all over the state, and these are some of the sort of the types of folks that were participating. And we held a series of meetings in May through September across the state. And we called the last one a summit. It was sort of our biggest meeting. And we put together what we called our platform of remedies. And it's a pretty complex document, but we went through each of the court's findings and discussed what the Education Study Committee and Legislative Finance Committee had already said about this. And then we discussed what the state needed to do immediately in the short term and what the state needed to do in the long term to address each and every one of these findings that the judge had made. We also developed a coalition called Transform Education, and if you all aren't part of that coalition, I would encourage you to get involved, and you can find them on the internet at transformeducationnm.org. But the goal of the coalition is to implement the Yazzie Martinez court decision. These are just some of the folks who are members of that coalition. There's many others, but it's a really strong group of organizations and individuals. And this is how the coalition we've kind of made the platform of remedies, the Yazzie remedy, look a little prettier this way with a multicultural, equitable foundation at the heart. And then the delivery of instruction, you know, teachers, quality pre-K and social services around that. And then surrounding it all, of course, is the funding system and the accountability system. So after the court ruled in 2018, we went into the 2019 legislative session with high hopes of some really big transformative work to implement that decision. And we were actually quite disappointed. Although additional money was appropriated and teachers did receive necessary salary increases, the districts weren't provided with the money necessary to deliver additional programs and services for at-risk students. And the institutions of higher ed weren't provided the necessary resources to develop their colleges of education and in order to be developing the teachers and the curriculum and the professional development that we know that we need and that the court found was necessary. So we went back to the court after that session and let the court know, because the court had written that we could file reports and give a status update. So we went back and let the court know just how disappointed we were. But at that time, we were in negotiations with members of the governor's office and the PED, and we were trying to pound out a plan of what the state would do to come into compliance with this ruling. But the state cut off those negotiations and basically said, if you want to do anything differently, you'll need to go back to the court. So in October of 2019, we did go back to the court and we filed what's called in the short term our compliance motion. But it was basically a motion telling the judge that the state had failed to comply with the court's original ruling and that nothing much had changed for our at-risk students. And that we needed a plan, that basically we needed someone in state government to take this sort of bull by the horns and grapple with this problem, engaging with the tribes, engaging across state agencies, across institutions of higher education, and develop a plan with funding sources on how over the next, say, 5 years, we were going to actually fix our school system. So that's what we've asked for in that motion, is a plan. That's essentially what we've asked for. And I love this picture because it shows on the left, Marcia Leno, and in the middle, Wilhelmina Yazzie. They're two of our lead plaintiffs who did have the opportunity one day to speak to the governor after they had given a public address at a conference. And I wish that we had that opportunity much more often. At the same time that we all have been developing a plan, there's been something going on in a parallel path, and that is Native American leaders across the state have been organizing and developing a platform of what Native students need for a sufficient education. And it's really been the best piece of work I've seen done around this case. It's really impressive because all 23 of the tribes have endorsed and signed on to this work and to this platform. And all 23 tribes have been engaged, as well as many Native leaders and educational experts, I'm sure many of you, engaged in developing this platform. And I just wanted to, recognize that. And it's similarly to the more general Yazzie remedy platform. It goes through every aspect of the court's decision that's related to Native students and talks about what is necessary for the state to comply with the judge's ruling. And sort of in a nutshell, what we have been seeking is developing the capacity of our educators, developing the capacity of our institutions of higher ed, developing the capacity of the public education department to assist our districts, increased resources for instructional materials, social services, literacy specialists, and extended learning time. Especially importantly now is number 5, which is funding for Wi-Fi across all lands, including tribal lands, a full day pre-K for 4-year-olds, increasing educator salaries, and then increasing the funding for our at-risk students in the funding formula. So the 2020 legislative session was even more disappointing than the 2019 legislative session. And I'm not going to talk about this much because I know that Representative Lente will do that. But importantly, we haven't seen additional funding for students with disabilities. We saw no additional funding for bilingual multicultural programming. The package of bills that was presented by Representative Lente that are necessary to enforce the Indian Education Act did not make it through. So yeah, there was just a great disappointment in the last legislative session. And on top of that, this is where we are now, as the legislative session was coming to a close, the state filed a motion to dismiss the case. And in the motion to dismiss, the state said essentially, look, we've taken some initial steps and you can trust us now to do the rest on our own. And we don't need the court's authority hanging over us. We just want you to trust us that we're going to fix the school system, and we don't need any more court intervention, and we don't need any more plaintiffs kind of pushing us. We think that this motion is not a strong position for the state to take at all. We think that the court made it very clear that it wanted to maintain its oversight authority until the actual school system was fixed. Interestingly, in the state's motion, they don't say that they fixed the school system and that it's now constitutionally sufficient. They don't say that. Instead, they say, we've taken some steps, we've done a few things, and don't worry, Judge, we'll get it done down the road. So I think that's a very important thing to hold on to, that not even the state is trying to claim that our school system is now sufficient. But they do want the case dismissed. And it's a little bit of a mixed message, given the fact that the governor has sort of proudly stated that she didn't appeal the decision. Well, she didn't appeal the decision, but she also hasn't implemented the decision. And now she's trying to have the decision dismissed. So we filed a response brief on May the 1st, our opposition to that, and just setting forth how the state can't be trusted to do this on its own, that's exactly the strategy that failed us for decades before we filed the lawsuit. And that now more than ever, given what's going on with COVID-19 and the state's budget, now more than ever, we need court oversight to ensure that it's not our school system and our students who pay the price for our current budget difficulties. And importantly, all 23 of the tribes, by way of the All Pueblo Council of Governors, and then the Navajo Nation, Mescalero Apache, Jicarilla Apache, they all expressed opposition and provided exhibits, statements to file as part of our opposition brief to the state's motion to dismiss. And the hearing on this motion, as well as the motion I mentioned earlier, which is a motion asking the court to order the state to develop a plan. All of these are going to be heard together on June the 29th at 1 o'clock in Santa Fe. I mean, that's assuming that the hearing can go on given the pandemic. We're hopeful that by then we would be able to have a hearing and get this matter decided. We're very hopeful that the court will order the state to develop the plan and that the court will deny the state's motion to dismiss the case. And if the court orders that a plan is developed, I think that would be a really critical time for all of us to provide input on what that plan needs to look like, especially around implementing the Indian Education Act. And I will leave it there. This is how folks can reach me. That's my cell phone, which is also my business phone these days, and my email address. And then of course you can find much more information about the case and the remedies at those two websites. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Evans. Thank you very much, Gail. I don't know how to thank you for this. And I don't know what your future role will be with this case. You and I can maybe talk about that, but thank you very much. You have done a tremendous job on this. I know how much work you've put into this. So we have, according to the agenda, we are supposed to move right into Derek Lente's presentation, but Is it okay, Gail, if we take maybe like 3 questions? They got to be short. You can't like do a statement. 3 questions for Gail from anybody who's participating. So Brianna, I'll let you navigate that because you can see the whole screen there. So does anybody have a question that you'd like to say? You need to unmute yourself and ask.
This is Milton Bluehouse, Deputy Chief of Staff, Navajo Nation. I have essentially 2 questions in a very short statement. I want to know what the Office of Impact Aid's determination on the state's application for equalization funding formula, the denial of that application, how that may impact the state fulfilling its obligation under Yazzie Martinez. And related to that then is, what anticipation do you have in terms of the state's economic downturn and talks now of cutting funding across the board for possibly even the Department of Education, and how that ties into the conversation related to the state's fulfillment of Yazzie Martinez? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for those questions. We did mention in the opposition to the state's motion to dismiss that ruling from the Department of Education about impact aid. And basically, our view on that is that it shows that the state has been cheating districts out of millions of dollars, districts that have high numbers of Native children, and that practice will have to end. And at the same time, it certainly puts into sort of risk other districts, because if the state's response is just to lose that, not fulfill that money or fill in that hole that's now going to be left in the funding formula because they can't take credit for that money, then other districts will have less money, which is problematic for the other districts. So it's sort of really it means the state needs to come up with the money and fill in that hole that they can no longer fill in by sort of cheating the high Native districts out of their money. So I just think it calls again it shows the need for the court to maintain its oversight, because some big changes are going to be needed to address this new situation with the funding. We were pleased with the Department of Education's decision. I want to be clear about that. And now the state needs to fix the problem that the state created. And in terms of the long-term funding, I think that for years, and something the court found is that there are many ways that the state can raise money for education, and the state has had opportunities over the years to do that. And in fact, the state has changed its tax structure since back in '03, has made changes to the tax structure by cutting taxes to corporations, cutting taxes to the wealthy, and many other ways that has left the state with less money than it would have had if it had just left our tax structure alone. So I think more than ever, our state is going to have to start finding other ways to have money besides being reliant on oil and gas. And yeah, it's a big, difficult problem, and to us just shows that more than ever, we need to fight for the constitutional rights of our kids. And like I said earlier, they can't be the ones paying the price at this economic downturn. But I don't have an easy answer on where that money will come from. But like I said, there have been lots of legislative proposals over the years that would generate hundreds of millions of dollars of additional resources for our state.
Ms. Evans, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, this is Gary Montoya from Central Consolidated School District. I actually have 2 points. The first one is that CCSD was forced to sponsor the Ned Dream Charter School here in Shiprock, and the PED claimed that it was to rectify it for Martinez Yazzie in that aspect. And again, we didn't have a say-so, and it was being, again, forced upon us to have to deal with it as a board for oversight. So that's the first one. The second one, in light of what you're saying and to the question and concerns of the impact aid, that I was in DC in February, and I spoke to the congressional members and the states and the senators and told them to apply the law. And to me, from my opinion and perspective, if the federal government, when applying the impact aid money, would state and do exactly what it says to pay these students at an equal level 2, and I'm saying across the board, which the national expenditure for students is approximately $12,200. If they did that on all federal lands for all Native tribes across this country and military installations, we wouldn't have any concern as it respects to budget, and we wouldn't have to worry about the state for that funding source, because for us here at CCSD, with the amount of students that we have, you're talking approximately $67 million. So, and we would kick in our portion as respects to property taxes to the state, just like everybody else does for the counties. But really, it was one thing that I had told the governor, that the understanding of where this starts, it's at the federal level, and with that one word of equalization, and for the federal government to follow the law, how it applies. So it matters, really, that's where it starts with, and that fact that the state has realized and understand, both with Martinez and Yazzie and now the federal impact aid decision, we are inclined to receive that, because it says directly that that money goes to the LEA, not to be parked at the state, not to be held hostage and scraped off the top. So quite frankly, I think really the target is at the federal level, and to get them to pay, as they say, on an equal level 2, because really it amounts to, it's about equity as well. You can move it up equally, but there's still a disparity. So it has to be equitable straight across the board on average with the national expenditure for students across the country.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, and I agree that pressuring the feds to do that, I totally agree. I also believe under our state constitution, the state has an obligation to ensure that our school system is sufficient and uniform. And I'd like to see more state leadership. If state leadership means they need to be pushing the feds to help with those needs. But I think it's important to also, hold our state responsible where it's responsible. And in terms of your first point, I just want to say that the state's done a lot of things and said this is necessary or required by the Yazzie Martinez lawsuit, and it's not. If, for example, those equity councils, we didn't ask for equity councils. We didn't mention equity councils. We don't believe equity councils will bring the state into compliance with the Yazzie Martinez decision. But the state has said they're doing that as for Yazzie Martinez. And I've heard other stories, just like what you just said about the charter school. No. So I would just say that we have to be careful when we hear that things are being done because they're required by Yazzie Martinez. That's often not the case. And I'm happy to, if people hear that and they want to contact me and ask me, is this required by Yazzie Martinez? I'm happy to give you my opinion about that.
And if I may add to that, to the bigger point, does that not supplant the board's decision-making in regards to the policy of them forcing again that charter school upon us and using that as a pretext under Martinez Yazzie to try to solve their problems?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know about this individual situation, but I can tell you that there's nothing in Yazzie Martinez that requires charter schools or that takes away from the power of local boards and local decision making.
We have time for one more question. Excellent questions, Mr. Montoya and Mr. Bluehouse.
Good morning. This is Christina Aspis from Central Consolidated. And, you mentioned, Ms. Evans, about the photograph of Wilhelmina Yazzie and that where she met the governor. And I had my standoff with governor also. And I truly believe that the governor just pacifies And I've made some comments regarding the impact aid, and also in our area, we're facing the closure of our power plant, which is a large revenue source. And so those things have been brought up at New Mexico School Board Association conferences. And I believe now, just by her actions, I believe that, you know, it's more of the party agenda than really the, you know, the heart of it, you know, the Indian students, the Navajo students, or in our case, we have a mixture of Anglo and Hispanic as well. But so I say all our students in our area. So we have two things going in our area, which is the closure of the power plants mining, and then also the, you know, the disparity of the impact aid. And I just find it so disheartening how we look at our politicians and how they choose party over, especially when some of those are Native American. Thank you.
Yeah, and I agree with you that I think the beauty of this case is that this is not a political issue. This is a constitutional issue. And this is a problem that has been around over, you know, different administrations, whether they're Democrat or Republican, for a very long time. And I think that is the beauty of going to the court and getting the court's ruling that this is a constitutional right, and that in fact the Indian Education Act is you know, the enforcement of that is a constitutional right. And I would just encourage you all to work with, there's now a group called the Tribal Education Alliance, and it's a group of Native Americans pushing for how they're going to get this Yazzie decision implemented and get the Indian Education Act implemented. And yeah, it is a bipartisan effort. It really shouldn't be about politics.
Very good. There's a lot here, folks, and I'm thinking that we are going to most likely, IAIE, we are going to have a follow-up to this session, definitely. And I'm hoping maybe Ms. Evans will be able to join us as well and continue with this discussion, because there is a lot here talking about impact aid, talking about the constitutionality of these issues of education. I mean, it's fundamental in the New Mexico Indian Education Act. There's a lot of issues here, plus the idea of, in terms of the exterior, other factors that shape education and how we enjoy the quality of life. There's a lot of things here. So thank you, Gail. I hope you can stay with us a little bit longer. You are welcome to stay with us. And you and I will be in contact via email with Brianna. Okay?
Yep, thank you very much. I am going to stay on for as long as I can.
All right, thank you very much. So, Representative Lenti, are you ready to go?
I'm ready to go. Can you hear me?
Yes, and can we see you? And the rest of us will tune out our faces.
Absolutely. I don't know if you want to see me, but
oh no, we want to see you.
Okay. I'm here. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for allowing me to participate in this forum. It means a lot to me as someone who is from one of the pueblos here in New Mexico, someone that attended a public school, someone that has family members that still attend the public schools, someone that has seen the injustices, and someone that has fought for the children since his inception into the legislature. It means a lot to be able to share a story, to share my tale, to share my experiences with all of you, because I think the more that the many of you know about my experiences and about the experiences like Miss Evans, it brings to light additional questions or additional impacts in the way that you may want to formalize your thoughts or your actions towards this issue itself. And so really, over the past 3.5 years since I've been a part of the New Mexico legislature, I represent New Mexico House District 65, which is highly Native American. My district includes 7 pueblos. So I have many of the Middle Rio Grande pueblos, Sandia Pueblo, Santa Ana Pueblo, San Felipe Pueblo, Santo Domingo Pueblo, Cojurí Pueblo, Zia Pueblo, Jemez Pueblo. I have 5 chapters of the Navajo Nation and as well as the Hickory Apache Nation. And so since those 3.5 years have come and gone, I've found myself truly entrenched in many of the social justice issues in our state, many of the cultural site protection issues in this state, and of course the one topic that we're talking about today, which is education equity movements within our own state and in the legislature. And I have to say that, mentioned before, that because I'm a product of the Bernalillo public school system, or the public school system in itself, I think I bring a very unique perspective that many cannot offer, and the fact that I see many of our Native kids still having to deal with the same issues that I dealt with or my parents dealt with back when I was a student, brings much more fuel to the fire, so that we can bring some much needed changes to these issues. And so these issues, prior to me even becoming a legislator, were very much an issue that I wanted to fight for. But now having a different platform and a different area to be able to discuss these issues, it's been certainly powerful to be able to share that story, powerful to share that movement, and powerful to bring to light and highlight these inequities that we all know on this call today, that we are all facing within our own respective pueblos, nations, or tribes. And so regarding the education equity portion of it all, that I have to first recognize that there have been many, and many of you on this call today, that have fought for these issues for decades, for years and years, that have brought attention and focus to these really extremely important matters. And that in those tribal communities that many of you come from, those that work in tribal education, those tribal education employees at the various institutional levels, whether it's at the early childhood phase, whether it's at the elementary, middle school, high school, or university level, that all of you have made it your life's passion, if you will, to help and try to find and bring light and equity to these issues. And one more than others that have really helped me focus my way and strategize my way through at least the legislative portion of it all is one, Regis Pecos, which I'm sure many of you know, that has spent many of his professional lives work to help bring light to these issues. And so he was able to help me formulate thoughts, formulate ideas, help strategize in regards to how do we approach these issues on a legislative scale, on a legislative level, because right now the politics played, the strategies implemented are much different than perhaps what you may see from the outside. So to have his institutional knowledge has been really insightful and important for me. But since my first session in 2017, one of our first attempts at changing education and creating certain reforms was that of a Indian student needs assessment. And that was House Bill 484 in the 2017 legislative session. And mind you that as a Native American moving into that legislature, I found myself as a Native American always having to fight for things that were attempting to negatively impact our tribes, nations, and pueblos. So it was always a defensive mode that I was in, whether it was in regards to cultural sites, whether it was in regards to social justice, whether it was in regards to taxes and economic developments. So having to be able to play a little bit of an offense in regards to this House Bill 484 in the 2017 legislative session was something that I felt was really important, and something that we needed to be able to do as Native Americans within that framework of the legislature. And so many of you know what used to be House Bill 484 was eventually passed in the 2019 legislative session as House Bill 250. But back in 2017, it was really a novel idea to add a new section to the Indian Education Act, requiring that there be more teeth added to this act. That yes, it's nice to have an Indian Education Act, but if there's no teeth, then what's the point? So for this House Bill 484, the need to conduct assessments for enrolled tribal students within our public school settings, to prioritize budgets based on those needs of those assessments, to develop systematic frameworks to help improve those students' educational outcomes to become college or career ready. So a lot of these things were brand new and caught a lot of other legislators by surprise in regards to why we would want to even do this, how much is it going to cost, why, there was a lot of whys in regards to why we wanted to do this. But it passed both the House and the Senate unanimously on both sides. But back then, Governor Susana Martinez was then the governor. So while it passed unanimously through both houses, it eventually was vetoed by her in the 2017 legislative session. Here comes 2018. We did a little bit of a tweaking to the act itself. It came back as House Bill 151, with yet still again Governor Martinez in power, and again passed through both chambers unanimously, but then again vetoed by her as well. So it was odd, because after that 2018 session, it was very frustrating that why would she come through and veto this really great piece of legislation that would help to bring a lot of accountability to a lot of the public schools, and a lot of accountability and ability for our children to begin to succeed in public schools in our own tribal areas. And I can recall that this was the time during the Yazzie Martinez lawsuit that was discussed earlier. And so it was in July of 2018, and I had just gotten married in July of 2018, and my wife and I were overseas on a honeymoon. And I remember receiving a text message from Regis Pecos about 1 a.m. Their time, telling me that we had won the Yazzie case, and that everything that we had fought for was finally being realized, that everything we'd been talking about was finally being realized, and that it finally took somebody like a judge, like the courts, to finally ratify and signal that, yes, in fact, what we've been talking about for decades is real, and it's a reality, and it needs to be changed. And that struck me, because it brought a fire once again to me that we needed to continue to apply pressure where pressure was needed to make these necessary changes. And so since then, Gail Evans talked about the Tribal Education Alliance team, if you will. Teams have been created, establishments have been formed with some of the best minds in education out there to help with additional phases in our development of tribal education within New Mexico. And so obviously certain things that were learned in 2017 and 2018 was that legislation takes time and dedication to pass and to become successful. But what I learned in 2017, 2018 was that it absolutely is a bipartisan measure if we want our children to succeed. And so knowing that, I agree that this is not a partisan issue, that this is more of a constitutional issue, that we as a state are required to provide a sufficient education to all of our students within New Mexico. So going to 2019, this was Governor Michelle Lujan Grisham's first year, and I recall that session was deemed to education, and that we would have an education moonshot, because education was really important to everybody. And so while, as was mentioned, some of the moonshot took off, but much of the moonshot, as related specifically to tribal issues and tribal legislation, was left behind. Issues like bilingual teacher prep, issues like multicultural educational frameworks, issues like one that I have tried to champion for the past 2 years is Native American libraries and fiber optic or internet access issues. But one of the things that did take off was, in fact, those 2 years prior of having a vetoed piece of legislation was finally signed into law. And so House Bill 250 in the 2019 session was finally signed into law. And so as we look into as we look back at the 2020 legislative session and we look to the future, I have to agree. I think during the 2020 legislative session, it is unfortunate, but the state did not pass a single piece of legislation that contained any one of the tribal remedy framework pieces of legislation that were developed by the 22 tribes, pueblos, and nations over the grueling 9-month period prior to the legislative session in 2020. And so while all of those were endorsed and ratified through tribal resolutions, these 7 pieces of tribal legislation were accepted. We were able to tell our story. We had a very frank and honest discussion and candid discussions within those committee rooms. And again, bipartisan support, unanimous support throughout the entire process. But unfortunately, when it comes down to the financial aspect and the appropriations aspect of it all, that everybody loves the policy, but unfortunately, if you have great policy, but you don't have any money to back up that policy, then what's the point? So these pieces of legislation, there were 7 of them, House Bill 134 through House Bill 140, again, all formally endorsed by all the tribes. So having to do that, having had done that and bringing that, those bills were not my bills. Those bills were the tribes' bills. Those bills were all of the minds and the strategies and the thoughtfulness that all the tribes had put into these bills, that they knew from the grassroots level what would help their own tribal students succeed. And so of those 7 pieces of legislation, among those initiatives was about a $60 million investment directly towards tribal libraries and education resource centers and early childhood education facilities and internet connectivity for all of our tribes in the state. And about 40 million of that was for programmatic investments at the very fundamental tribal level to help with educational blueprints, to bring their departments up to speed with the ability to begin to focus on how they can help best their own children within their own communities, with emphasis to support tribal programs at the university level so that those in the university settings could also help to support those that are in the tribal level. So there was a lot of thoughtfulness that went into these bills, and once again, went through the process, passed unanimously through the education committees. But once it hit that appropriations level, unfortunately, while once again, very much thoughtful discussion was had, candid discussion was had, and everyone was nodding their head in agreement that yes, absolutely, we need to be able to fund these types of initiatives, the hammer had to drop at one point or another, because once again, it was made mention that there was no money for these types of initiatives within the state's budget. And so it is unfortunate, but that this type of pandemic that we're in currently has illuminated in ways that cannot never ever be denied anymore, that the lack of adequate educational facilities that we have on our own respective pueblos, nations, or tribes, our internet access has simply exacerbated the educational and digital divide, and it further underscores the inequities and the injustices that many of our kids are feeling today. That while many of those children that are in urban centers were handed out Chromebooks or iPads and have daily lessons through a Skype or this type of format that we're on today, many of my students in Torreon, New Mexico, in Santo Domingo, Pueblo, were given paper handouts saying, here you go, fill these out, we'll give you another one next week. Self-taught, self-learned, and that's no way for us to be able to become college or career ready. And it's an insult that I take personally, because it's not right. It's not right. And so when we failed in that aspect during the 2020 legislative session, I would have to say that the state failed once again to pass a final fix for the Impact 8 discussion that took place just minutes ago as well. Even though the governor and the Speaker of the House mentioned to all of the tribes on the first day of the 2020 legislative session that it was one of their priorities to have that fix done. And so while we ushered it all the way through the end of the session, politics comes into play. And when you're one of many in that body, it's tough to try to push an agenda. I know that I've had really frank and honest discussions with many of those colleagues that are within the House and the Senate, but they're not always in agreement as to how you move forward. So after the 2020 legislative session, another unfortunate aspect of educational equity or equity in general took place when many of our capital outlay dollars for many of the tribes, nations, and pueblos were vetoed. So over $30 million of capital projects were vetoed for our tribes and pueblos. And this was by far one of the largest amounts vetoed designated by any category of governments. So, I take great offense to that as well as we move forward. But unfortunately, once again, this pandemic just continues to expose the dire third world conditions that many of our tribal communities currently live in, without running water, without lack of housing, with a lack of housing, excuse me, and with our under-resourced health facilities and transportations. I mean, these issues compound our inability to succeed educationally. And so we have some readjusting to do, and we have some more work ahead of us. So as was mentioned by Ms. Evans, when the motion to dismiss the Yazzie Martinez lawsuit took place in March, I read about it on social media, and immediately I thought, well, it talked about how the state wants to dismiss. And when I think about the state, as a representative, I'm a part of that state. And when I looked further into it, it talked about how the governor supported it, how the legislature supported it. And I thought to myself, well, I was never consulted on any of these things, so I do not support this. So immediately I reached out to several of my colleagues inquiring if they had also not been informed of this decision as well, and several were not. And so it wasn't but for a week or so after that I formulated a letter, and with about 16 of my other colleagues in the House, we wrote a letter in early April to the governor of our state, dismissing and basically saying how disappointed we were that in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic that the state of New Mexico found it appropriate to file a motion to dismiss Yazzie Martinez, and that we don't agree that they have complied in any way, shape, or form with the ability to provide an equal access and a constitutional mandated access to a sufficient education to any of our Native kids or any of those kids represented in that lawsuit. So she has that on her desk, knowing that that's a part of the record. And intentionally, I opted to not make this letter public because we were just in the infancy of this pandemic, getting blown out of, getting away from all of us, and I did not want this to become political. And so many of people do not know about this letter, but it's one that the governor has on her desk and one that will be brought up when the time is appropriate. And so, as we move forward, I look forward to working with that Tribal Education Alliance, that we can do things, that we have to begin to continue to apply pressure where pressure is needed. That while prior to early March of this year, that we were on track to have to be ready come 2021, that all of the pieces, the puzzle pieces were put together, that the dollars were going to be there, and that we knew that we had bipartisan support, and that all it was going to take was just that next filing of legislation and that next discussion of the bills, and then hopefully the appropriations of those monies. But then here comes this pandemic now, throwing a monkey wrench into how and what we are going to see in the future. And so it does not excuse, however, the fact that the burden is not on the tribes, but the burden is absolutely on the state to make this right. That failure is expensive. And how the state will respond it may define a political will, but more importantly, it will define what's right as policymakers in this state. That on every level that was mentioned by Gail Evans, that the state has lost its arguments and has been indicted on its failure to provide a sufficient resource for the education of our children. And at its most fundamental level, we have to be able to provide for that. We have to be able to show something for that. And we have to become accountable to that. And so this pandemic has thrown a monkey wrench into this mix, like I said before, but nonetheless does not excuse the pressure that will be felt once again when we go back into the 2021 legislative session, because again, our work is not done. Our work has yet still many miles to go. So with that, Doctor, I hope that I was able to give you an insight as to what I feel in regards to legislatively we have come through, where we are going. I will stay on the call for the duration of the meeting to answer any questions if there are any, but I truly hope that I gave an insight that was one of my perspective as a tribal member, as a legislator, as someone that has, you know, fought for the kids for many years at this point, but one that if my comments are too candid, if my comments are too honest and you were offended, I apologize, because it's not my intent to offend anybody, but it's my intent to fight as best as we can for our kids. So Dr. Martinez, thank you for the opportunity.
I'm offended. No, I'm just kidding. No, I'm not offended. In fact, I applaud what you're doing. Thank you for taking all this hard work that you've been doing. And it's really nice to see how you and Gail Evans, you know, are going in and out. And, you know, I was hoping Regis was on the line, but I don't see him here as a participant, him and Jasmine Yepa. But thank you very much. So I wanted to just briefly just tell you a little bit about Mr. Lenti. He's very humble. He didn't talk about all of his accomplishments, but as he said before, he earned his BA in Intercultural Communications in English from UNM, so he's a Lobo. And he also got his Juris Doctorate from the University of New Mexico. And he is currently the New Mexico representative from in the New Mexico House of Representatives. He represents District 65, and he is currently running for re-election. So that's all I'm saying. And you can do what you want with that information. But he has been an advocate. He has been at the forefront. I have witnessed him testifying in many, many committees, Senate committees, House committees, in the House of Representatives. He has been doing this work far longer than the Yazzie Martinez case. In fact, we were on a TV program some time ago, way back. And so I want to thank you very much. So that stated, are there any, we can take 3 questions for Representative Lenti, and then we are then going to move into our small groups.
Dr. This is Milton Bluehouse.
Okay, let's go with Gary Montoya first, and then Milton Bluehouse.
Okay, Representative Lenti, you just spoke a little earlier about the session for next year. What about the considerations for the special session in June? We're hearing about a sweep, the possibility of a sweep. And 2, in light of what you're talking about, the pandemic, the inequities up here at Central Consolidated School District and within the region, it has multiplied exponentially what we face and have been facing over the past number of years that I can recall from being born and raised here and seeing and going through the school system, my kids going through it, now my grandkids. And what I've been telling people, and you kind of touched on it, because every issue that we deal with is coupled together. That's the economic circumstance. It's the political aspect of it that plays into it. The unemployment above 50% here, even higher now. But to what you're talking about and what you stated for legislation and politics and influence, again, all these things play together and impact us. And what I've made mention to all the way back into January, I've been telling people that the politics and the policies of individuals have a direct impact on these kids. I said, everybody sees the problem, but the ones who actually feel it are the kids. We're talking about San Juan Generating Station up here. and impact aid decisions and the ETA. You're seeing exactly what's going to happen when that is fully enacted. The oil and gas industry, the extraction industry goes away.
That's right.
And we challenged the governor when she said publicly, if you find something viable, she would get out of the way. So I told her that. This is what you said. So we're asking for support and in-chat because 80% of our revenue for the functioning of our schools comes from San Juan Generating Station. So the effects of those economic policies have, what I've expressed to people, has basically done what happened to the Navajos back in 1863 or 1864, where it forced them off their lands. We are seeing it in Page. We are seeing it around us where the extraction industry is being impacted and families are being forced to leave their kids with grandmother, grandfather, putting them in boarding schools and having to leave the reservations. And it's destroying a people and it's destroying a culture because people are so hell-bent on an economic policy that is destroying them, and people don't understand that, but we are feeling that.
Mr. Montoya,
see it.
thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I don't know if you had a question in there. Do you have a question real quick?
Towards the special session and the sweep of what's coming up, from my understanding, in June.
Okay, so
how that affects us.
Okay, so that's your question to Derek Lenti. Okay, Representative Lenti?
Mr. Montoya, thank you for that question. The special session that is imminent in June will in fact take into account a very harsh sweep of many of the capital outlay dollars that are still left on the table. We were put on notice that many of our 2019 and 2020s dollars that were out there, if they're not encumbered, would be swept, and other financial aspects would also be looked at as well, that everything was on the table. But hopefully by the time we do go into special session in June, that the federal assistance package that is discussed will have in fact come through and materialized to our state, so that we would know and have a better footing and a better understanding of what the federal government would be able to offer to the state in terms of helping us to help our budget. So until that happens, we are all still at this point guessing. But for instance, this afternoon, I will, with other leadership members in the House, be talking on a conference call to discuss what measures we'll be having to take as we move forward. But one thing that I can make for certain is that when everybody's talking about educational aspects and sweeping monies from different places, that I and others have made a commitment to stand strong, because we already know, and it has been discussed and it's been broadcasted throughout the world at this point, of what type of facilitations and what type of impact this pandemic has had within our own tribal communities.
Thank you, Mr. Lenti. Milton, do you have a quick question?
Yes, a very quick one. Guatse, Representative Lenti. This is Milton Bluehouse, Deputy Chief of Staff, Navajo Nation. I want to again thank you for your advocacy and legislative support for Indian education. My question and statement is, with the June session being proposed and the session coming up in the winter time, I think it might be very important to begin prioritizing the economic recovery impacts, quote unquote, the sweep that state is envisioning that may impact PED, and more importantly, education funding for tribal schools and Native American students. And so that being said, then one thing, and I imagine you're keeping this on your radar, is to ensure that those impacts are prioritized so that they're not as extensive for Native students, given the historical lack of funding. And that being said, then the statement would be to all of the Indian education leadership and tribal leadership on the call now, is to begin thinking forward about how to strategize and advocate so that those economic recovery, quote unquote, sweep initiatives the state may undertake, most likely will undertake, has a less impact on Indian education spending within PED. And so those are some of the advocacy strategies that I see thinking forward for June and then later in July. And I just want to say thank you again, Representative Lenti, for your help.
Mr. Bluehouse, if I might, absolutely, your comments are well taken. Those discussions are actively happening right now. I know that the Tribal Education Alliance are looking at those issues, that we understand that we're going to beat this crisis. We're going to go through and become stronger after this pandemic has come and gone. We understand that, but we as tribal nations, we're going to be here forever. And so we have to plan for that future. So whether it's educational aspect of it all, or the economic aspect from a tribal's perspective, that we're having those discussions as well. How do we as tribes make sure that we are put on a solid footing again economically? Those discussions are happening, and I'm very much well a part of those discussions. So again, comments well taken. Thank you.
Thank you. We have time for one more question or comment.
I have a question.
Hello.
Okay, Alice from Taos.
Yes, thank you. Good morning, Representative Lenti, and thank you so much for all the work that you're doing. I'm from Taos Pueblo. I'm a Tiwa language instructor, and I've always felt that the Indian Gaming Compact revenue should be returned back to our tribe. So I had a quick question. You know, we're going to be looking for funding for all our programs that we need for the Yazzie case for our Native students. And so that was my quick question is, the Gaming Compact revenues, is there any way that that could be earmarked or brought back to our tribal communities? And I don't know all the, you know, how all that funding formula works, but I've always felt that our tribe should get back our gaming revenues back to the tribes. Thank you so much. Ta'a.
Good morning. Thank you for that question. You know, the aspects of the gaming compacts is a slippery slope, because the last thing that many tribes want to do is reopen those compacts for further discussions, because the last things we want to have happen is lose that exclusivity for gaming in the state of New Mexico. And if we talk about our ability to retain all of that revenue that is shared with the state, then we would have to reopen those compacts for further negotiation and discussion. One thing that I have pushed, that we are pushing with the governor, and I will push with the legislature as well, is during this pandemic, the governor herself reached out to me in early March, asked me for my assistance with those gaming tribes, to ask them to shut their doors, because this pandemic was a real threat to the state. I did so, but all the tribes understood that in doing so, they were going to be put at a huge financial disadvantage, because the money that they make from these operations go to directly fund their governmental organizations. And so in doing so, we discussed already at length the fact that we should not have to pay those revenue sharings for this duration, perhaps the first quarter, the second quarter for 2020. We don't know that what it's going to be yet, because of the impact this pandemic has had on our tribal nations. So Alice, those discussions are happening right now. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. Is everybody back? This is so weird. Okay. So I hope all of you had a great conversation. I know in our group, we had a really good conversation. We have ideally maybe about 5 minutes, 10 minutes left. So could I have each group, either your note taker or your facilitator, do a 1 minute? I mean, it's got to be fast. What were the major issues brought up in your group discussion? Okay, so Nate, you're first.
Hello. You know, I think we ended our session talking about the issue of access between bureaucracies and the bureaucracy issues that are alive in our state. And what we meant by access is, you know, there's people who need culturally sensitive information, like our teachers, and there's people who have it, like at the university level, like at UNM. I mentioned your course, Dr. Cajete's courses, that have these strategies, these techniques in place, and a ton of research. But how do we get the access to the people who need it around our state, and the people who have it at the university? Because we're systematically tied between tuition, you know, you have to register, funding. So that's one of the big themes that came up in our discussion.
Thank you, Coach Charlie. Appreciate that. He's an offensive coach. For those of you who don't know why I said Coach Charlie. And one of my students when he was just an 18-year-old guy. Okay, next group, Wendy, your group.
So very quickly, one of the biggest things is that school districts are being held accountable when the state was the one identified in the lawsuit. That came out as a very powerful point. Funding is kind of being tossed out to everybody and everyone's making a mad grab for it, but really there needs to be more advisement and more support and something that's much more systematically established. Thirdly, the assistant secretary for Indian education needs to be brought on, and not just someone's friend, but someone who's actually adequate to actually address all these remedies identified by Judge Singleton. Number 4, equity councils are not sufficient. That when we're pulling this group in that was established, it looks like back in 2005, they're not adequately really creating the initiatives that are supporting school districts, but the accountability should be held at the state level. So those were some of the top points, but everybody, I took great notes, so I'll go ahead and make sure I clarify those points. Thank you.
Thank you. Lloyd, Professor Lloyd Lee.
Well, Belen took some great notes, but it's very similar to what's been said by Wendy and others, is that there haven't been any changes, not in terms of within the classroom itself. There are a lot more compliances orders from the state and PED, when in fact, like Wendy mentioned, this has to be put on the state, not just the school district. And so there's a lot of redundancy in terms of what is expected of the school district and particularly with the equity councils. I think there's not a beneficial aspect to it, although it is, they think it's important, but it's not, it's sort of redundant in terms of what they already been doing within their school districts. And then also the need, as has been mentioned about with the parents and the families in regards to the questions that they need to be learned about in regards to asking when it comes to these issues.
Okay, thank you. Leola.
So our group talked about a lot about the same sentiments. Obviously, you know, the remedies are not being made or met. The Equity Council, it's not necessarily the solution, and it's created a little bit of chaos for some local areas. And a lot of our discussion came back to, you know, the experiences of our families and our communities, and what can we do as individuals and our communities to create communication for education, and then, you know, what can we do to go from here, and also, you know, not spin our wheels so much, but just really honor the work that's already been completed. We know what works, so just keep pushing for that.
Okay, thank you, Leola. Terry, and then we'll go to Natalie. Dr. Flowerday.
So in our group, a lot of the same things that people have already talked about. 3 things that did come up that were a little bit different, and I hope I represent this correctly. One thing is that there's so much disconnect between the different bits and pieces of grants and funding that's coming, and that it would be very, very helpful if there was like one person or one entity coordinating everything that had to do with Yazzie Martinez and the mandates put forth in Yazzie Martinez, because it's very difficult and very confusing navigating all the different pieces of grants and funding that's coming in. So that was one recommendation. Also, another thing that came up that we talked about is several people said, don't reinvent the wheel, don't reinvent the wheel. It's, you know, we have good programs. We focus on what isn't working, but there's a lot of things in the communities that are working and in the schools that are working. And why are we not focusing? Why are those not being brought to the forefront and actually being funded at higher levels? Because there are things already happening that are working. So let's fund those. And then the other thing, a couple of positives. one of our group members said that they have noticed that there's more communication at the district level than there used to be. So they saw that as, you know, a positive. And also that they've seen some of the funding come earlier in the school year, so that could actually be used. They said in the past it had always come very, very late in the school year when it couldn't even be used for the programs that they wanted. So they would like to see that continue and a push be made to get the funding to the schools for programs as early as possible, like in the school year or even before the school year started, so that they could actually implement these programs.
Very good. Okay, Natalie, you're the last person here, I believe. Yeah.
Wendy. Whoop.
Oh, I'm sorry. No, Wendy already went.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Okay, thank you. All right. So I'd like to reiterate the conversations, the main themes pretty much came up in our conversation as well. There were some additional concerns in terms of access to be able to influence the equity councils, and that really has just other experts in the field don't have access, who could potentially have impacted it and who actually had put some information out to try and help shape them, who are no longer part of the conversations. The other ideas that we talked about, we would agree that this is just a creation of an additional layer of bureaucracy. There's a lot of redundancy. I would reiterate something that another group said regarding the types of funding and the competitive grants that are out there. It becomes a compliance issue, and so there was a bit of wondering: is the PED using this as a way to claim consultation? Because they are collecting so much data, and it's redundant data from different sources. And so they're again going back to kind of streamlining it. There was a concern about the amount of time that people who are appointed to these equity councils need to invest in order to do their job well. It was reported as pretty much a full-time kind of a position, like. And so there are some things that come out as a result of that. The one positive thing is that it is engaging more people in the school districts to learn about some of the issues regarding equity. But at the same time, it's also very time consuming. It's a very cumbersome process. And there's people are wondering, does this funding then detract from programming and other direct support kind of services for children? And does it then also impact the effectiveness of pre-existing programs and initiatives that we're already working within the schools, such as the Indian Education Advisory Committees within the schools, and some of the parent committees that were already operating within the schools. And then for districts that have a majority population of Indigenous students, there's a lot of overlap, and the state is not being very forthcoming and not being responsive in terms of how do you address those kinds of things. So that pretty much sums it up. Thank you.
Thanks, Natalie. And I forgot my group. Berdine, you want to report? I'm sorry.
Thank you. Basically, the questions that were asked were, are the remedies in Judge Singleton's ruling being met? A lot of our group agreed that it was not being met at this time. We do have equity councils that are being formed, but we don't have a direction for the equity councils. So, and then another one had mentioned that the equity councils don't have authority. One thing that was brought up in our group was doing an audit for an equity audit, and trying to figure out for our students what would we be able to, before we move forward, find some achievement gaps and apply the remedies, like helping the teachers and principals find those gaps and address them. So our colleges need to do a better job at preparing our teachers and our principals in regards to equity audits. I'm trying to think of other things that were also said.
I think those are the major points.
I think so too.
Yeah, that equity audit was actually brought up by Dean Burley, and Dean Burley, but not now. Okay, you can talk about it. He really got into it, but and it's good, and he'll talk to the College of Ed more about that equity audits. So it looks like we had a really good discussion, and it is now 12:32, 12:35 actually. So we're going to bring closure to this. Thank you, everybody. I wish you all the best. I wish you good health, a good life, peace, all the positivity I can send out to you. And thank you for your utmost attention to this, as well as your work in the community. Ta'a.